Golly, it's so nice to see this group of people.
Liz, welcome. I see you all are starting to roll in. If you want to catch up on who our speakers are, you can look in the chat where I put very brief bios and a link to more extended bios. But we'll wait a couple of minutes because, well, first of all, it's not even 1:30 yet, but we want to make sure everybody gets in.
I think it's so wonderful that this session for the end of the conference is apparently pulling together many of the things that we've all been talking about all week.
I know. It really,
we didn't know it when we planned it.
We hope that we're going to send people off with a, I was going to say a bang or an inspiration. It's 1:30 now, but we'll give it another minute or two for folks to roll in and get into the webinar, because I know that there were quite a lot signed up.
Cathy, when we go to the slides, can I just give you the number of the slide to pull up, or should I go in the order that you have it here?
I'll do it however you want, Schroeder.
Perfect, thanks.
Okay.
All right, I'm realizing I see everyone except Elaine. So I imagine that when she speaks, she will pop up.
That's okay. Just so you know, we are live for everybody right now
Yeah.
who's in the conference. Yeah.
Yeah, we're just making sure that everything matches up.
Yeah, I see Elaine too.
Good.
All right. Welcome. It's 1:31, so I'm going to just slowly kick us off here. Welcome to Options for Activism for Museum People. If you'd like a little preview of who your presenters are and what you hope that what we hope that you will be taking away from our session today, please check out the chat where I put earlier today some very brief bios with links to our extended bios. There are many of you here who I've known over a lot of years in my years at NEMA. And in my recent couple of years, I've sort of switched to being doing more flexible museum work so that I have more time for activism outside of the museum world, in addition to my activism in the museum world. So this is a very exciting topic for me. And as Annie said a moment ago, there are so many key themes that we've talked about this week about the critical issues facing our field as well as the world, and also the importance of each of us individually. And I hope that this session, as we wrap up this conference, will help send you off in a good place. Just to let you know what we're going to do, we will have Annie Storr will be kicking us off in a moment, and then we're going to have our three guest speakers, Elaine, Gurian, Schroeder Cherry, and Erik Jorgensen, each share a few words and then have a roundtable conversation. And then we have, hopefully, unless they get chatting really heavily, we hope that there is time at the end for some Q&A. So please, sort of midway through, you can start putting your questions in the chat, and I will be monitoring those. And towards the end, we will incorporate those in. But right now, I would really, it is my honor to introduce Annie Storr, who I met this summer in the virtual world through a NEMA session. And I'll let her take it away from here.
Oh, right. Well, thank you very much. Facebook was gracious enough to tell me that 9 years ago today, I was in a district courtroom in Washington, D.C. as a court watcher to attend the arraignments of 72 of the Washington, D.C. occupiers, including last, my son. So I'm thinking about how being involved in social justice work is something that we find ourselves involved in ways we never expect, or something that we want to make sure that we include with intention as part of our our working life, whether it's our career life or it's however we do that, that many of us in the museum field have social justice concerns, political concerns, and so on, beyond our job descriptions that we want to keep integrated in our lives. For me, it was being a court watcher and becoming more and more and more involved in the Occupy movement out of that. This session grew out of one of the early, or two of the early town hall meetings, which NEMA put together for us in the spring and the summer. And as Cathy says, we met in a session that was dedicated to the career concerns of mid and later career museum colleagues who were thinking through, even in the early stages. We know much more now in November than we did in March and April and May and June. But we're thinking about how the crisis of COVID was making us rethink our careers and rethinking our work. In some senses, in some cases that meant how we were going to make income. In some cases it meant how are we going to rebalance the workloads in our families. But though it was not written into the session description in these hour-long conversations, in both of them, the question came up, I'm feeling somehow that I need to respond to what's going on in the world, whether it's pandemic, whether it's racial injustice, whether it's climate, whether it is my concern over the current presidential situation, whether it was one of other important social causes that meant something to us. And out of that discussion, we ended up not so much talking about whether people were rescheduling their retirement plans, or whether they were deciding whether or not they would give up their jobs early so that younger colleagues could continue in their museum work. But we started talking about what we really wanted to do with our working lives. And it seems to me, from the people I have known through a long museum career, mostly in Washington, now in Massachusetts, that I have known people who have found a way of speaking for and acting out their concerns for social issues within their jobs, or have been frustrated that they couldn't. And so they got involved in a side organization or founded a side organization, or took on a second life, in effect, and did it on top of their professional work, and in some cases decided to leave the museum field in order to do what was an increasingly clear calling for them. So the conclusion I had drawn is that if this is what you want to do with your life, I mean, if it's important, if this is a priority in your life, you can find a way to do it. And Cathy, who asked that first question in the first town hall about this issue, and I decided to team up and bring together three people who have found a way to succeed in these choices in very different ways. So if you are looking for a model, if you're looking for someone to speak to, if you're looking for a way of thinking of reinventing or reconceptualizing what you're going to do in your work, in a museum, beside a museum, or outside of a museum, we hope we will have some insights for you today. We have decided to ask as our first speaker, the first person I thought of. Elaine Gurian has been a colleague to many of us, a friend and a mentor to me. She describes herself simply as a senior museum consultant, but many of you will know that she has been a writer, an advocate, involved in many of the foundations of innovative museums at the Smithsonian, the National Museum of the American Indian, the National Museum of African American History and Culture, the Holocaust Memorial, the Children's Museum in Boston, the Institute of Contemporary Art, when it was just beginning its education program. She's always been there as the face of the people and the people's concerns. So we've asked Elaine to speak first, followed by Erik Jorgensen, and then Schroeder Cherry. And I'm going to turn over the microphone to Elaine with my thanks. You're muted.
Thank you, Annie, and thank you, everyone. Even virtually, it's very nice to be back in New England where I began. And let me focus completely on what you can do by at least reflecting on what I'm looking at and what I did as a way, I hope, to tell you that what you want to do is just exactly what you should be doing. In 1969, I went to work for a thing called Summer Thing, which was set up by the then mayor to try and keep Boston from exploding over the assassination of Martin Luther King. And I, by accident, did the programming for the Craftsmobile. And from that experience, I went to the ICA and from there to the Children's Museum. But I entered the museum world as an activist, and I have thought of the museum itself as a place of activism, and I have not changed that view. So that is my view, which is that the museum itself is a source of profoundly important activism in social good. I am, and I didn't know this until Annie asked me to join this panel, and for this reason, but it wasn't my own self-descriptor. I use all the systems that are available for activism. I use elective politics. I use public speaking. I use writing. I use the way I use Facebook. I use private correspondence, and I use my work. And the way I use my work is mostly under the radar. I am a professional deputy. I look at the tools of budget making and of HR as political tools. So I am not a person who thinks the in-your-face exhibition is the way to go. And the reason I don't think that is that it seems to me too easy to knock you out then, because it's a very clear thing to come after. I am, for example, at the moment, the most interested in the HR world when we look at systemic racism. So rather than look at systemic racism exactly frontally, I think the impediments to what we are trying to do are embedded in the system itself. And that the system itself is the arena to be playing in. I also believe in doing everything. By that, I mean believing in your colleagues and let them do what they're doing, and don't feel guilty that by what you are doing, it's not enough, not big enough, not global enough, not prominent enough. It is what it is, because it is the little things that build silt that make the activity meaningful. One day, as an example, I saw the list of what under Barack Obama the trans community had been able to get done. One of the things was that they could have the photo in the persona of their choice as an activity that Barack Obama had made happen. I thought how powerful that was when they went to get their passport, that they could be the person that they knew themselves to be, but that required a tiny piece of activity in a bureaucratic system to make it possible to have your photo be exactly the way you wish. And so that's what I look at all the time. I look at the ways in which my opposition is using the tools, and I use the same tools, but I demand that they come from a set of personal morality choices of my own. So I wish I had said, when he goes low, we go high. but I try to live by that motto. I think the most often question I get asked is, what if you're not the director? And my answer is always the same. You have an enormous amount of power laterally, and everyone is watching you all the time. They're watching the way you behave, the way you act toward the people as you encounter them, the way you wander into the museum, the way you speak on the phone, the tone of your emails. And the compliment I care the most about was one given to me when I was a senior consultant to an African-American museum, not the one in Washington where I was also a consultant, where the woman said to me, the leader, "We have not been watching you for 15 minutes. We have been watching you for 15 years." That's the way in which you want to make sure you understand that how you greet strangers, how you answer letters, who you thank is being looked at as a way of building trust within the community. I have many examples of what I'm talking about, but this is enough for me to begin with.
Thank you, Elaine. Let me then introduce Erik Jorgensen, who is a former museum administrator and Humanities Council director, who is, hear this, finishing his fourth and final term in the Maine House of Representatives and is currently a candidate, I believe the election is in about 10 days, for Secretary of State, which would make him responsible for future elections in the state of Maine. Am I correct? Thank you, Erik.
Yeah, that's right. It's as I've been telling people, that might be the time when the dog finally catches the car. In Maine, the Secretary of State deals with elections and also the state archives, which is in my wheelhouse more, I think, and also the Bureau of Motor Vehicles. And I find them all three of those things really interesting. So we'll see how it goes. But so I really enjoyed hearing what Elaine said, because I think what I'm saying, she's talking about working with the system. I'm talking about also working within the system. And I think to think about my vision of advocacy or what that means, I think it's useful to start looking at sort of my career, which has been a kind of non-linear one. It started really out of a desire to be place-based. And driven by a sense, I think, with both myself and my wife, that if we left the state for other jobs, we'd never get back to Maine. So based on that sort of structure, we then started, what began as a museum career, I think morphed into a broader cultural work at the Humanities Council before landing in the very strange world of elected office. But I think the values of one really help inform the others. And that's important. But it did begin in museums. And I think that that's a driver of professional identity for me, even though I haven't worked in a museum for years. I think the snap of excitement that you feel when you learn something from an exhibit or see a beautiful restoration project on a structure or understand the historical forces that go into making a town what it is. I think these elements have stuck with me for 30 years. And I really think I really don't believe you can understand the present at all without understanding the past and trying to figure out how you can avoid making mistakes in the future. So I think museum people bring this to whatever they do, and whether they stay in museums, whether they go in entirely different domains. I think the stuff that you bring from a museum career is super helpful for advocacy or anything else. I got into museums starting off at the Pejepscot Historical Society in Brunswick. I'd been doing some exhibit fabrication consulting. I'd been working at that place in the summers as a site manager at one of the museums there. And it was one of these things where the directorship opened up and they'd had a much better credentialed and older person who had been hired, but then that person backed out at the last minute. And I thought, what the hell, I'll throw my hat into this ring, and I got the job. And I think it was one of those jobs that in some ways, if I'd known better, if I'd had more experience, I never would have taken it. You know, I learned a lot about, I didn't understand that leaving your paycheck in the bottom drawer because you might bounce was anything other than normal. So it was but I was there for 10 years. It was a job that was extraordinary. And what an experience it was to be a wonderful organization, wonderful institution, lots of community support, and I learned a lot. I then went back and got I guess one of the things I just point out during that time, I think that was really seminal for me, was going to the Seminar for Historical Administration. Also now I think called something, the History Leadership Institute. I found that out. But that was a 3-week seminar at Williamsburg, and that was just an extraordinarily important thing for me in thinking about the potential of this profession. But I then went back to grad school and sort of faced a fork in the road. What do I want to go more in museum work or more in material culture or something like that? Or do I go in the direction of, do I go in a different direction? And I ended up choosing something I thought was a little broader. I ended up going to get a degree in public administration, and I went to the Kennedy School, and I did that with a focus on internal management of public organizations. Not a real museum degree by any stretch, but it was one that would work in most nonprofits and would also, I think, it would allow me a lot of options for what I wanted to do in the future. I then went on to spend 12 years at the Maine Humanities Council, where I started as an assistant director and later served as the council's director for 6 years of those. And I began to get involved with a state initiative for cultural funding. And that was something that got me very interested in how government worked together, how the state government cultural agencies worked, and started to teach me a little bit about advocacy for policy. But then it all came down to 2011. And at that time, there was a couple of things. I'd been at the council for 12 years. I was getting a little concerned about the federal budget and whether I'd have to be demolishing work that I had done, and cutting things back. And I sort of felt that I'd done what I could there. And then at the same time, someone asked me to run for the legislature. I mean, I guess, again, it wasn't really on my agenda, but it happened. And I thought, maybe that would be something I could do. And that's a really weird thing, to be honest with you. Elected office is a very strange way to apply for a job. And I just sort of did it. You put yourself out there and you hope for the best. But I've ended up being for 8 years in the legislature on the Budget and Appropriations Committee. One of the factors of having, one of the things that happens when you're in a term limited state, you end up getting onto committees fast. And they need you people to learn stuff early so they can last and have enough time to be contributing. So I got onto that committee and I've been there, and it's been really interesting to work on budgets. I mean, I think talk about a place where advocacy can work. You can actually really advocate for what's important. One of the things we like to say is that a budget is a moral document. And I think budgets do encapsulate the values of government. And when you think about, they illustrate the priorities. And when you realize that 35% of state funding goes to human services, at least in Maine, about 40% goes to K-12 education, and then everything else is the remaining 25% or so is everything you think of as state government. That's from prisons to courts to economic development. That's where all the battles really occur. And I guess the question is, it's interesting for me, you learn a lot about the reality of scarcity. There's never enough money. That's not unlike museums. You learn a lot about the reality of reality as well. I mean, I went into this thinking I could really advocate for cultural funding. And that was one of my definite goals. Turns out that it's just really hard to advocate for individual areas within the budget, particularly when there's just cuts being made to extraordinarily important human services and other things. So I don't think we've hurt cultural funding much, but I haven't been able to grow it much. But the real question always is, how do you do the most with scarce resources available? And when budgeting, you tend to gravitate to places where there's the most injustice, the most suffering, and the most acute need. And I think it's a triage process constantly. It's like any other management thing at some level, but you listen to weeks of testimony and you learn an awful lot about your state and its people and their needs. And I think that's been a really good way to, I think, express my desire to advocate for good things to happen. But also every day that I take what I learned in the museum world about place and about people and about community and about justice, and I bring that to the work I do in the State House, and that's been really good too. So that's all I'll say for now, but thanks for inviting me today, and I'm glad to be here.
Sorry about that. We had a tech glitch.
I had this horrible sense at one point that no one could hear me and I was talking for 7 minutes without anyone hearing.
No,
me.
no, we wouldn't have let that happen.
You were clear.
Thank
Very
you.
good. Thank you so much, Erik. Next speaker is Dr. Schroeder Cherry, who is a friend and is an independent museum educator and an instructor at Morgan State University.
Thanks, Annie. What a joy to be on this panel with you guys, and a little intimidating following Elaine and Erik. My trajectory in the museum field has always been focused on interpretation and accessibility. My first paid job was at the Art Institute of Chicago while I was in undergrad. And the challenge was to bring that collection to high school students in Chicago. So we developed a summer program for 2 summers consecutively. And that's when I got the bug. That's when I knew I want to be in the museum field. I want to be surrounded by people who are dressed in all black and speak articulately about art and the collection in the museums. So over the years, I've ended up working in museums in Chicago, New York, DC, Los Angeles, and Maryland. And throughout that time, I was dealing with interpretation and accessibility. But I'm also trained as a visual artist and a puppeteer. So throughout my museum profession, I always had this side gig. And when I could, I would bring it into the museum world. Can we have slide number 3? Actually, I want the puppet. Yeah, that one. I'm showing this because I want people to embrace their other side. The people who work in museums are typically creatives, and we do more than one thing at a time. One of the things I do is puppetry. So I wanted to bring puppetry into the museum and give adults a free space to play, a sense of freedom in learning about culture and objects. I didn't think of it at the time in terms of a type of activism, but I guess it was, because I was doing something that was out of the norm for the time. Can we go to, I'm trying to see the slide. The paintings. Okay, this is another puppet performance. I'm just going to move around in my conversation about what I'm doing now, because in addition to teaching at a university, I teach grad students museum education. I'm also, as an independent artist, performing as a puppeteer in different venues, museums, libraries, and cultural centers. Now that COVID has made social distancing a reality for many of us, I'm figuring out how to make these programs accessible in digital form. So this is a slide of a puppet show called The Children's Crusade, and I'm talking about the civil rights movement from the 60s. I wanted to share information about children who were involved in the civil rights movement. So here we see a puppet, and the large puppet, the rod puppet, is the one who actually narrates and tells the story, and he manipulates the other puppets when he talks about how the children were facing the police force, the firemen with hoses, and dogs. But they were instrumental in actually moving the civil rights movement around and garnering attention nationally. Next slide. Recently, I've been working on a series of paintings. This is from the Barbershop series. It started off with my interest about the history of barbering in America, particularly with Black barbers, who I didn't know initially. Black barbers in America started off when white men of means wanted to emulate European aristocracy. So they would let enslaved men cut their hair and shave their faces. Well, that grew into a profession. And over the years, it has morphed into what we have today. And talking about social activism, barbershops today are places where people have conversations about a variety of things, but that includes politics, social events, historical events, family matters, everything. But it is a social activist place currently. Let's go to the John Lewis piece. This piece is a sculpture. It's an assemblage piece. It's on a washboard. It's made out of wood. I sew and cut into wood. This piece was made to commemorate John Lewis, the congressman, after his death. And it also was used as a poster because around the election period, there was an organization that wanted to develop posters to encourage people to vote. So this was a competition. This piece was accepted in the competition, and posters were made to plaster up around the city. So this was a piece that talked about radical racism. You decide, remember to vote on November 3rd. Next slide. This is a group of the puppets. Recently, I've been exploring with puppets on the video, as I said, and I was responding to things at the moment. For example, when Black Lives Matter was having a lot of protests in the streets, the puppets would do a short video about the importance of learning your escape routes if you were going to be protesting in the streets. They also did a short clip on the importance of wearing a mask during COVID. Or at one point, I was responding immediately to the issue of not drinking disinfectants to cure COVID. Being able to put this on video with puppet form reached a large number of people through social media, and which I was really happy it spread. It was beyond my immediate control. People just kind of took it and ran with it. And I think that is a form of activism. Next slide.
I think that's all of them.
Okay, good. Then I can talk about what I'm doing at Morgan State University. I have a foot inside and outside of the system, and right now what I'm trying
Exactly. And you've got a couple of minutes to do that.
is I'm training museum professionals. The students that I have some museum experience, but they need a degree to advance in the field. So I feel like I'm helping them enter and navigate the system. We're looking at such things as not just the discipline, because I'm thinking that young professionals need to understand museums as organizations. Who's responsible for governing? What is the hierarchy in terms of staff within that organization? And where do you fit? If you want to be a curator, if you want to be an administrator, if you want to be a registrar, where do you fit in that hierarchy? And how does that organization actually work? So that's what we're focusing on there. I also had, and I'll end with this, I also had an opportunity to establish what I call the beginning of a pipeline for the professions. And we developed a summer program for high school students. It's an intensive 6-week program where they're immersed in museum professions. They visit a total of 8 museums. They also have workshops in terms of how to work with cameras in the museum and how to deal with graphic design. And I designed a seminar where they're doing a lot of reading on the background and the history of museums. The program culminates in them doing an exhibition. So the students go into the museum's storage room and they pull out objects and they install an exhibition and they put together a publication. The purpose for this, for me, is to get young people to start thinking of themselves as potential either museum professionals or people who will support museums. And this program was funded by Carnegie Mellon. I'll end with that.
Well, I thank you all. Elaine and Erik and Schroeder, we're so glad we invited you to be here. We put some time into the program so that the 3 of you could, having heard each other and heard each other in our prior conversations, might ask each other questions or respond to the comments you've heard. And then we will have sufficient time after that for an audience Q&A coordinated by Cathy. So would any of our 3 speakers like to say something to start a conversation among you?
I would like to point out that Erik and Schroeder and I talked about the tools that are sitting in the profession, most especially the financial tools, which you often think of as outside the purview of your job and in the control of other people. But in fact, those are the tools, follow the money, that allows priorities to be set. And in learning what the hierarchy is that Schroeder talked about, there is also the way to learn how the hierarchy could be. That what you want to be is both optimistic and not naive. So when you listen to how it works, you need to be thinking all the time, but I could change how it works as long as I know how it works. So don't listen to how it works as a prescription to how you have to fit in, but only listen to it in giving you the tools that other people are using to make things happen that you wish to have happen.
I'd like to add a comment, just very quickly to respond to what Elaine said, which is think about what your skills are and don't underestimate them. I think that the set of skills as a museum educator that I've used the most in the organizations in which I've been involved, mostly in economic inequity, 99 and 1% issues, is my training in outcomes assessment from education. Gauging what's going on in a group of people, what worked that we tried and what has not worked, and how to steer an effort in a new direction. So I never would have thought that my outcomes assessment skills from education would have been relevant, but they've been constantly used. Anyone else? I didn't want to stop Erik or Schroeder.
Well, I might add just that I was listening to Schroeder's comments about working with young museum people and going to visit museums. And I don't think there's anything more just pleasurable than getting a group of museum people together to go into a museum and experience that as a group. I mean, it's what a yeasty, wonderful experience that is. And I just think that's super cool. And it sounds like you're really interested. I really like the idea, though, of encouraging people to really think about the mechanics. I think what Elaine said is absolutely right. I mean, I don't think it's ever a bad direction necessarily to think about going into museums through development or through other areas, just because those are very important areas. And, you know, in a small organization, you can often, I don't know about I've been out of the field long enough to think about it, but I mean, to not know this, but I mean, I think it's probably possible to move around within the museum, but that's probably an area where you can actually enter at some level. There's always a need for that. And it's so important to understand how these institutions run.
Annie, I'd like to build on this notion about young people going to museums, because one of the things that happened to me as a young person, and I would hope what happened to Schroeder's people, was that I was not welcomed. The first museum I went to, I was followed, that I went to by myself. I was followed, and whether I was paranoid or not, I don't know. But one of the things that I would ask Schroeder's kids who are going to museums is to both figure out whether they were feeling welcomed, and if not, what they would have needed to feel welcome and how they would fix it. That the first visitor is not to be fit in to the way in which museums work. Part of this institutional racism is the projection of etiquette that really is unfriendly. And trying to figure out with kids their first time in might be the way to begin museum goers as activists.
That's a good point. I think exposure plays a large role in that. In fact, my students, which are coming from Maryland, many times have never been into any of these museums in Baltimore, except for a trip they vaguely remember back in the 3rd or 2nd grade, but they didn't remember much about it. So the comfort level begins from the very start. We're going into this space. This is what you can expect to experience. Let me know what you need. And we build a comfort level with confidence, actually, before going into the institution. But that's a really good point. I wanted to talk about something for current professionals too. In the program for graduate students, one of the components that I infuse is the importance of learning how to develop a grant proposal. That is de rigueur for right now for any nonprofit organization. And I think anyone who works in a museum has got to understand what that actually looks like, whether they're going to be charged with doing it alone or with a team. They have to understand proposal development.
And could I add to that the fundraising system is a 5-point system. So I live on a tiny island in the Caribbean that was hit by Maria. What we work on all the time is the parts of the grant writing program that are the most difficult, because while money is made available, if you don't know how compliance works, if you don't know how investigation and cultivation works, your chances of getting a proposal are not great. And there again are all the subtleties of the system that need to be interrogated by you. One of the things that happens on my island, because this is a Spanish-speaking island, but in the United States, is that people cannot fill out the appropriate papers and therefore are denied those parts of the system that are available to them. There is all kinds of ways to interrogate the system so that you use the system for social justice.
Struck by a memory of breakfast at a retreat center that trains left-wing cause activists. Breakfast with one of the greats of the civil rights movement, Vincent Harding, who stood behind Martin Luther King for many speeches and wrote the drafts of some of them. And he turned to me when I was saying something very abstract and idealistic, and he said, remember, social activism is a practical, tactical enterprise.
Exactly.
Questions here. One of them.
Sound, Cathy.
Oh, all right. Sorry. Thank you. I'm going to start with sort of a big picture question that was asked here about in an era where misinformation is rampant, how can museums reaffirm and strengthen their positions as trusted sources of information and take a greater role in activism?
Well, one of the things that the question implies I don't accept, and that is the museum as the source of the information. And therefore teaching people to figure out how to use information and multiple points of view of information and understanding how to discern between false and non-false information has a much larger role for the museum. What I'm really interested in is how do we do multiple voice exhibitions? How do we do unresolved exhibitions? And how do we start to make space for people who have differing but at least fact-based arguments so that we can return civility to the public square?
I agree with that. And I think it's important to remember that museums are about critical thinking and analyzation when you're dealing with collections or objects, whether they're living or non-living. But when you get to the point of trying to discern whether something is fake news or not, I think we have to be careful what role we're playing so that we're not biased at any point, but we come back to that notion of thinking critically and analytically.
Cathy, did you say there was another question?
Yeah, there's so we definitely have some nice comments.
Sound.
Oh, sorry, everybody. This dual laptop thing is getting me. So we have a very specific question for Erik, and I think that certainly others can type in too. Does being a former museum executive director help you shepherd your efforts to fund and support cultural efforts in Maine? Other legislators understand and empathize with what nonprofits are dealing with, particularly in the current situation.
Cathy, can you say just a snippet of that and speak directly into your computer because you were going in and out?
Oh, yes, thank you. Basically, how does his experience as a former executive director help inform his work in the legislature? And does he find any empathy from other legislators and understanding about the needs of cultural organizations?
Yeah, I'd say there's a lot of empathy. I think people do care about this stuff, and that comes on both sides of the aisle. Whether it translates into funding, that's a different story, but I think that it's very important. I think for me, what I've really valued from my work in the museum world, as far as being a legislator goes, is that I know the state very well. And a lot of legislators come from one town and they don't really know much about the rest of the state. And Maine's a vast place. I mean, my house is closer to New York City than it is to northern Maine. And I think that people forget how big it is. And the cultures are broad. And, you know, we have Acadian culture, we have French Canadian, we have a lot of different groups, as well as new Mainers, you know, immigrants, a lot of folks who are maybe different than people have in their everyday town. So I spend a lot of time thinking about bringing that knowledge and that perspective to my whole job. I also work, but I'm not in the legislature right now, as a funder in a small foundation in Portland, and that's I certainly see every day this idea of like, just how do we build support for these institutions that are suffering right now. I'm not sure state funding is where that's going to come from, just because the state budgets are so clobbered right now with everything else. And I'm not sure I don't think anyone can say we should fund less on food security and more on arts. I mean, as public money, I would like that more than anybody, but I'm not sure it's the right thing. So I don't know, I'm sort of discoursing right here, going all in circles, but I think those are some of the issues that I bring to it. But there's no question that having been a museum person really helps understand the state, which really helps me in my broader mission of trying to be a legislator.
Erik, if I may insert, could I ask you to flip that question and say, as a legislator, what do you wish we museum people understood?
Well, I think it's important to understand that fact to begin with. I mean, it's just the money thing is hard, but I also think it's important for museum people to know that there's it's important for the world to understand the culture and the background and the history of our states and how they are put together. And certainly right now with BLM going on and everything else, these are issues that are coming up huge. So there's a huge need to educate legislators and make sure they're tuned in. Because I think there's things that the museum world can do without necessarily asking for money, which they should be asking for that too, to be very honest. They should be asking for it. But I think there's a lot of things that people can do to testify on behalf of bills and issues. That's a very important place for people with, you know, some information, some informed, you know, knowledge and other things they can bring to the table to testify on behalf of education policy or other things that, you know, come to bear. So the budget, for example, when we're working on the state budget, it's 8 weeks of straight testimony from the public on every single line. And, you know, it just helps to have people who have a broad vision. And I think museum people do that as a whole. And so that's what I'd offer.
And I'll add that I think that dovetails really well with the keynote that we had yesterday from Sarah Sutton, or 2 days ago. The days are a little blurred now. But talking about the intersectionality of the crises, and that if we as museum people only think about our museums, we don't have this broad perspective and we don't stand out and advocate for all these issues for a better community, that we're losing sight of something, and that we inherit, you know, museums, there's a piece of museums that really understand that, and so we need to take that beyond our walls.
Can I put in a plug for elected office? I was elected in New England to the educators. That's my first elected office. The educators, EdCom, then under Bonnie Pittman, ran systems by which they put up people outside the slate by petition. And I became elected to a national place on the AAM board by petition. That had the effect for me of what Erik is talking about. I heard other people from other parts of the country. I watched the system of politics and I realized I liked the system. Elected politics works the same on small and large levels, and understanding how the system works allows you to intersect in it. Yesterday, a museum that I'm working on in the Ukraine was invaded by the police because the museum itself is a political entity. And those of us who don't understand that museums are substitute political entities when somebody wants to make it so, leave themselves vulnerable for not knowing how the politics works. The people in Ukraine are revolutionaries, and therefore they understood the whole system. They understood how to document the system. They understood the tools of Facebook. The reason I know all about it is they understand how to protect themselves. We are not separate from the system. And in fact, national museums are exemplars of the system's aspirations. And running for elected office, even small and low down, is really, really useful.
Well, I'll just add, if nothing else, what it does, it gives you a firsthand view of different opinions and the legitimacy of those opinions. I mean, I found so many people that call me and they scorch me on decisions that I've made and things I've taken votes on. And that's not always pleasant, but it's also, you know, half the time I find both sides of the issue really do have legitimate points to make. I don't always agree with the other side at all, but it's oftentimes, if you boil it down, there is some nugget of truth to both sides, and it makes it hard. But I think the level of partisanship is so bad and the level of misinformation is so bad. I do think it's great to get out there and really try to listen to what other people are saying. And I'd say that's why I think if you have an elected official that you are represented by, you should reach out to them and get to know them a little bit. And most of them want to talk to you. Most of them do want to be, and they all want to do the right thing, even though some of their ideas of what the right thing is may be in diametric opposition to your own. But
well, for me, this leads into a conversation that we started to have in our pre-conversation about we clearly have a divided country, and how can museums be welcoming and understanding that we're trying to, many of us are looking at how do we welcome to audiences we haven't reached, but we also now have a growing audience of people who are less interested. Do they view us as the sources of truth anymore? And Elaine, you had sort of kicked off that discussion the other day, so I don't know if you'd be willing to speak to that.
Well, I'm deeply focused on the fact that 70 million people voted voluntarily for Donald Trump. 76 million people voted voluntarily for Joe Biden. But there are 70 million people who made a decision that is a decision, by all means, looking at it for non-truth, non-rational, and racist ideology. Regardless of your position in what's going to go on next, what has to go on next is healing the country. And we who voted, I assume, on one side, need to know and be sympathetic in the way that Erik is talking about the people who voted on the other side. Because our fellow citizens, nearly half of them, voted for something that I don't recognize as democracy. This isn't about people. I don't recognize the system. And museums, if they are going to be a place for conversation, is going to have to know sympathetically people to whom we are, at least I am not sympathetic at the moment, and I need to learn to be. So the long journey we've been on about inclusion is a journey of justice. Left out the people to include that we didn't like, or at least I didn't like. And now we have to change that to do a very much more complicated system.
I think museum professionals also need to rely on the fact that we are still one of the few communal spaces in our society. There are not a lot of places where people from disparate backgrounds or disparate beliefs can actually come in and share a space. So it's incumbent upon us to figure out, what do we do if we can bring this group of people together in one space? And perhaps it's not addressing those things that make them polemic, that make them polar.
I agree.
Just take that viewpoint away and create this space where they can interact with each other.
I totally agree.
Yeah. I will just say there's a lively chat going on of people engaging, sharing how they're connected in elected politics. And Meg Winnicates, as the advocacy director at NEMA, is starting to recruit people. So that's great in the chat, which you all can't see. And there's also a lot of affirmation of many of the themes that you've brought up. There is a specific question for Elaine about the soft power on boards. And is it really soft power if you're holding an elected position?
I don't understand the question. What does it mean? I don't think boards are soft power, for starters. And I think our paying attention to boards and boards in a kind of collusion that asks for favors are hardly soft power. And that a look at the board structure and our rules about board engagement is a fundamental piece of work that has to happen if we're going to get structural racism in the broadest section out of there.
I'm remembering being again corrected. I seem to learn a lot from being corrected by people. We were talking about soft power and hard power, and the person I was speaking to said, no, 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 no. The discrepancy is between clear power and fuzzy power, and it is much easier to oppose clear power.
Annie, why don't you lead us into a closing?
Well, I wanted to invite each of our speakers to think about what we have been saying today or what you would like to have had a chance to say. Last admonitions or encouragements to our audience. And I will start off so I don't have to finish by saying, if you get involved in a cause that matters to you, be aware that no issue is ever fixed, resolved, and set right. It is always, whatever we're talking about, racial justice or economic justice or any of these, it is going to be shifting and ever changing. So be ready for reversals as well as for successes, and take the long view, because if you're, if you're here today, if this is something you've been thinking about, if you get involved in social activism, you're in that movement for the rest of your life. With that framework, I'd like to turn over, perhaps we would ask our speakers to finish up in reverse order, so that Schroeder, who came last, might start now first, and then Erik, and then Elaine. Or you may pass.
I think I'll do it and be done. I'd like to encourage our attendees to think about the role that museums play with authenticity, with knowledge, and being safe communal spaces. Keeping in mind that we are in a situation now that we keep hearing the word unprecedented. What is our role in these unprecedented times based on the strengths of museums as institutions?
Thank you so much. Erik?
Well, I would say that I think this has been a great conversation, and I would just urge people to run for office or take that risk. It's a great way to learn about yourself, a great way to help advance things you care about. It is working within the system, there's no question, but you can get into the system and you can monkey with it once you're in there. You have access to the levers, and that's a very important thing to keep in mind about. You got to fight for good policy. It doesn't just happen by itself. But I also think if you don't run, I just say, get involved and find out what your legislature's up to or your city council, and think about, look at issues in terms of how they will really make a difference and who benefits. And these are good questions to have as citizens. They're good questions to have as museum people. And they're really good questions to have as policymakers. So thanks for inviting me today. It's been great. I love coming back to me.
Thank you so much, Erik. I'm going to turn over the floor for a moment to Elaine, and then to say that Cathy started us off, and I'm hoping that she will take the last word.
I'd like to say that you matter. that what you choose to do will make a difference, that you don't use a screen, a scale of what you're doing doesn't matter enough. It is an immense world out there that needs a whole lot of action and help. And what fits best with you and what you care about is what you should be doing. And your neighbor will be thinking about doing something else. And we as a big mosaic will have covered all the bases.
And I will say a huge thank you to this amazing panel, this amazing conversation. And on a very specific note, just if you don't want to run for office, do what I've done, which is get to know your elected officials, get to know how the process works. We have a voice and we should use it. And for you individually, may your passion feed the world's deep hunger. And may it be a labor of love. And if that means leaving the museum world or walking in both worlds or pushing from outside, there is a place and you're needed, and this is the time. Thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you, Cathy, for being my partner in this.
Thank you, Elaine and Schroeder and Erik and Annie. And thank you for Meg, our wonderful technical host, and for making such a wonderful conference. And go forth on what are museums now? Let's shape it forward.
I'm seeing Meg appearing back on the screen, and just to throw this at her, I think if members of our audience would like to continue the dialogue, I'm willing to bet that NEMA would help us create another town hall or another way to do that virtually while we're still in our homes.
Absolutely. Fantastic. If folks are interested in continuing the conversation, we can absolutely pick this up again after conference. NEMA's taking next week off, but email me after Thanksgiving.
May that begin right now.
Could we
Thank you all.
see?
Goodbye.
Could we see the comments? Is there a way for us to see?
Yeah, I'd like to see those.
Yes. So the conference platform is going to stay live for the next 3 months, so people can get back in here and reread the discussion and, copy it, archive it, whatever you need for your own conversation. And I will certainly also be happy to follow up with folks as well. So
Great. Thank you.
If you want to talk more about advocacy, I am all here for it.
Yes.
Thank you so much for attending the conference with a real charge of inspiration. Really appreciate it.
Thanks.
Amazing what you can do with an hour. When we have such... Thank you all so much.
Thank you all for coming.
Well, thank you for inviting us. No, it was great to be invited. Thank you for giving us all voice for this.
Thank you.
Right.